Subscribe to Cheating Tales Lab. Now let's begin. The fluorescent lights of the distribution center burned Seth Jones's eyes as he clocked out at 2:47 p.m. His supervisor, Miguel, had sent him home after Seth spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, emerging pale and sweating. The flu had been tearing through the warehouse, and Seth had finally succumbed. He'd worked at Morrison Logistics for 8 years, moving from forklift operator to inventory manager. The job was steady, the pay decent enough to support his family in their modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Drive. His wife Natalie handled the books for a dental practice downtown. Their son Robbie, 7 years old, was in 2nd grade at Roosevelt Elementary. Seth pulled into the driveway at 3:15, noting his mother-in-law's silver Buick parked in front. Dolores Reed had been staying with them for the past 6 weeks, ever since she'd sold her house across town. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until she found a suitable apartment, but Seth suspected Natalie was in no hurry to see her mother leave. The house was quiet when he entered, too quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. Robbie should have been home from school by now, probably in the living room with his dinosaur figures or watching cartoons. "Natalie," Seth called out, loosening his tie. His head pounded, and his stomach churned with nausea. "I'm home early. Caught whatever's been going around the warehouse." Footsteps creaked from upstairs. Natalie appeared at the landing, her expression flickering with something Seth couldn't quite read. Surprise? Annoyance? She descended quickly, smoothing her dark hair. "You're home," she said, stating the obvious. "Are you all right? I feel like death." "Where's Robbie?" "Playdate at Justin Birch's house. His mom picked him up from school." Natalie moved past him into the kitchen, her movements brisk and purposeful. "You should rest. I'll make you some tea." Seth nodded, too miserable to question further. He trudged upstairs to the bedroom, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the bed still wearing his work clothes. The ceiling fan spun lazy circles above him. That's when he heard it. A faint scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from inside the wall behind the headboard. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. Seth lifted his head, listening. There it was again. He sat up, pressing his ear against the wall. The scratching continued, almost frantic now. "Natalie," he called down the stairs. "There's something in the wall up here." She appeared in the doorway moments later, Dolores behind her. His mother-in-law's face was placid, almost serene, as she regarded him with her pale blue eyes. "It's just rats, Seth," Natalie said dismissively. "We've been hearing them for weeks. Mom and I were going to call an exterminator tomorrow." "Weeks?" Seth frowned. "Why didn't you mention it?" "I didn't want to worry you. You've been so stressed with the new distribution schedules." Seth stood, pressing his palm against the wall. The scratching intensified, taking on an almost desperate quality. This wasn't the scurrying of rodents. This was something else entirely. "No," he said slowly. "This isn't rats." "Seth, please," Natalie began, but he was already moving. He went downstairs to the garage, grabbed his sledgehammer from the tool rack. His hands trembled, from fever or adrenaline, he wasn't sure. When he returned to the bedroom, both women had moved to block the wall. "Seth, you're being ridiculous," Natalie said, but her voice had a sharp edge. "You're sick. You're not thinking clearly." "Move," Seth said quietly. "Listen to your wife," Dolores interjected, her tone syrupy and condescending. "You're overreacting to some rodents. Go lie down." Seth's eyes narrowed. In 8 years of marriage, his mother-in-law had never taken Natalie's side so quickly, never been so insistent. And the way they stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human barrier between him and the wall, it sent ice down his spine despite his fever. "Move," he repeated, "or I swing anyway." The women exchanged a glance. Then, slowly, they stepped aside. Dolores's expression remained eerily calm, a slight smile playing at her lips. Seth raised the sledgehammer and brought it down with all his strength. The drywall exploded inward, white dust billowing into the room. He swung again, and again, creating a hole large enough to see through. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pulled away chunks of drywall and insulation. And then his world stopped. In the darkness between the studs, lit by the afternoon light filtering through the hole, was a small figure. Robbie sat with his back against a stud, his thin wrists bound with zip ties to the wooden frame. His clothes were filthy, his face streaked with tears and grime. A piece of duct tape covered his mouth. Seth's knees nearly buckled. Robbie, oh God. He tore away more of the wall with his bare hands, splinters driving into his palms. Behind him, neither woman moved or spoke. When the hole was large enough, Seth crawled through, his fingers fumbling with the zip ties. They were pulled so tight they'd left deep red welts in Robbie's wrists. Hold still, buddy, hold still, Seth whispered, his voice breaking. He yanked at the duct tape, peeling it gently from his son's face. Robbie drew in a shuddering breath, his eyes wide and unfocused in the sudden light. He blinked rapidly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Daddy, he whispered hoarsely. I'm not alone in here. Seth froze. What? Look down, Robbie said, his voice barely audible. Seth looked down into the cavity between the walls, into the darkness that extended down to the first floor. His eyes adjusted slowly, picking out shapes in the gloom. Bones. Small bones, yellowed with age, scattered among old insulation and rat droppings. A tiny skull, no larger than a grapefruit. And another. And another. 3 tiny skeletons lay in the cavity beneath where Robbie had been bound. Seth felt bile rise in his throat. He pulled Robbie free from the ties, lifting him out of the wall space. His son clung to him, small body trembling. When Seth turned back to the bedroom, Dolores stood in the doorway, blocking the exit. That smile still played on her lips. You weren't supposed to see this, she said calmly. You were supposed to work until 6, like always. Natalie was going to let him out at 5:30, feed him, clean him up. You've complicated things, Seth. Natalie stood beside her mother, arms crossed, expression blank. No shock, no horror, just inconvenience. How long? Seth managed to choke out, clutching Robbie closer. Oh, Robbie's only been going in the walls for about 4 months, Dolores said conversationally, as if discussing a hobby. Just an hour or 2 at a time, when he misbehaves. It's discipline, Seth. Structure. Something boys desperately need. And the others? Seth's voice was barely a whisper. The bones. Dolores's smile widened. Mine were older. From my first marriage. Stuart Jr. and the twins, Sarah and Samuel. Such difficult children. They learned eventually. Well, Stuart did, at least. He's quite successful now, lives in Portland. But the twins. She sighed. Some children simply can't be taught. Seth stared at this woman, this monster who had sat at his dinner table, who had held Robbie as a baby, who had smiled and laughed and played the doting grandmother. The world tilted sickeningly. Natalie knew? His wife finally met his eyes. Mom was teaching me her methods. Robbie's been so defiant lately, the tantrums, the backtalk. Traditional punishment wasn't working. Mom said time in the wall helps children appreciate light, appreciate freedom. It makes them grateful. Grateful. Seth's voice cracked. You put our son in the walls. You tied him up in the dark. It's not abuse, Natalie said defensively. We fed him. We checked on him. It's just enhanced discipline. Seth looked down at Robbie, who had buried his face in his father's shoulder. He could feel his son's heart hammering against his chest, could hear his whimpers of fear. Something cold and hard crystallized in Seth's chest, replacing the shock. He gently set Robbie down behind him, keeping his body between his son and the 2 women. Get out of the doorway, he said to Dolores. I don't think so. Her blue eyes glittered. We need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation. Obviously, you're upset. Get out of the doorway. The force of Seth's roar made both women flinch. He took a step forward, and Dolores stumbled backward into the hallway. Seth scooped Robbie up again and pushed past them, taking the stairs 2 at a time. In the kitchen, he grabbed his phone from the counter. His fingers shook as he dialed 911. Wait. Natalie rushed into the kitchen. Seth, please, think about this. If you call the police, they'll take Robbie. Child services will get involved. They might take him away from both of us. Is that what you want? Seth paused, his finger hovering over the call button. The operator's voice came through. 911. What's your emergency? He looked at Robbie's terrified face, at the welts on his wrists, at the hollow look in his eyes. Then he looked at Natalie, at her calculated expression, at the manipulation in her voice. I need to report, Seth began. Natalie lunged forward and slapped the phone from his hand. It clattered across the tile floor. You're not thinking clearly. You're sick. You're in shock. Let's all just calm down and talk about this rationally. Dolores appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Seth saw she was now holding something. A syringe, filled with clear liquid. Sometimes, she said softly, men need to be calmed down. Natalie, dear, hold the boy. Everything happened in slow motion. Natalie reached for Robbie. Seth twisted away, putting the kitchen island between them. Dolores moved with surprising speed for a woman in her late 60s, circling around the other side. Seth's mind raced. He was outnumbered, running on fever and adrenaline, holding a traumatized 7-year-old. His phone was on the floor across the room. The front door was blocked. These women, these monsters, had been torturing his son for months, had killed 2 children decades ago, and now they wanted to drug him, to silence him, to make this all go away. He needed to think, to be smart. One wrong move and Robbie could be hurt, could be taken from him. All right, Seth said, raising one hand in apparent surrender. All right, let's talk. Just put down the syringe. Dolores smiled. Of course, let's all just calm down. But Seth was already calculating. He'd been watching the way Dolores moved, stiff in the hips, favoring her left side. A fall 2 years ago that never quite healed right. And Natalie, his wife of 8 years, he knew her tells. The way her left eye twitched when she was uncertain, the way she looked to her mother for direction. He had one advantage they didn't know about. He'd been listening to true crime podcasts during his long shifts at the warehouse. He knew about evidence preservation, about forensic investigation, about how abusers operated. And he knew that if he walked out that door with Robbie right now, called the police from outside, his son would be taken into protective custody during the investigation. Natalie was right about that. The system would see 2 parents in dispute, and they'd remove the child while they sorted it out. But if he could document everything, if he could make them confess on record, if he could build an undeniable case. Seth slowly lowered himself to sit on the floor, still holding Robbie. You're right, he said, forcing his voice to sound defeated. I'm not thinking clearly. I'm sick, I'm in shock. Help me understand. Help me understand why this was necessary. He saw Dolores and Natalie exchange another glance, saw them relax slightly. They thought they'd won. Seth Jones had always been a patient man. He'd learned patience working inventory, tracking thousands of items, finding discrepancies that others missed. He'd learned to see patterns, to think ahead, to plan. And now, holding his traumatized son, staring at the 2 women who'd tortured him, Seth began to plan the most important inventory of his life. He would document every crime, catalog every piece of evidence, and ensure these monsters paid for everything they'd done. But first, he needed to survive the night. Seth sat at the kitchen table, Robbie still clutched in his lap. His son hadn't spoken since they'd come downstairs, just pressed his face into Seth's chest and trembled. Dolores had reluctantly put down the syringe. Seth had insisted, playing the role of the beaten man who just wanted to understand, but it remained on the counter, within her reach. Natalie made tea, going through the domestic motions as if this were a normal afternoon discussion. She set 3 cups on the table, one for herself, one for her mother, one for Seth. He noticed she didn't offer anything to Robbie. You have to understand the history, Dolores began, settling into her chair with a satisfied sigh. She'd always loved an audience. My father raised me with a firm hand. Very firm. He believed children were naturally sinful creatures who needed correction. When I married Gerald, Natalie's father, I tried the gentle approach. Timeouts, talking, all that modern nonsense. She took a sip of tea, her movements precise and controlled. Seth watched her carefully, noting everything, filing it away. But Stewart Jr., he was willful, defiant. He'd scream for hours, break things, hurt the twins. Gerald left us when the children were young, couldn't handle the stress. So it was just me and 3 difficult children in that big house on Sycamore Street. You remember that house, don't you, Natalie? Natalie nodded. I was very young. Stewart Jr. was from Dad's first marriage, and the twins were. I barely remember them. Because I protected you, Dolores said sharply. You were the good one, the obedient one. But you're half-siblings. She shook her head. My father visited one weekend and saw the chaos. He took me aside and explained the old methods. The walls in that house were thick, built in the 20s. Perfect for teaching patience. Seth's arms tightened around Robbie. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his expression neutral. Stewart learned, Dolores continued. After a few sessions in the walls, he became quite manageable. He's a corporate attorney now, very successful. We don't speak much, he's chosen to distance himself from the family, but he turned out well. The twins, though. Her face darkened. Sarah died in the walls. She simply gave up, stopped eating the food I'd bring. Samuel tried to escape, tore his hands bloody on the studs, made such noise the neighbors might have heard. I had to quiet him. The casual way she described murdering 2 children made Seth's blood run cold. He swallowed hard, tasting bile. And no one investigated? He managed to ask. No one questioned their disappearance? Dolores smiled that terrible smile. I reported them as runaways. I was a distraught single mother with a troubled home life. The police looked for a few weeks, then moved on. This was 1987. Records weren't what they are now. Eventually, Gerald and I divorced officially. I sold the Sycamore house and started fresh. Mom never used the methods again, Natalie added. Not until Robbie started having problems. Because you were such a good girl, Dolores said warmly to her daughter. You never needed correction. But when you told me about Robbie's tantrums, about his defiance, about how he'd hit you and scream, she'd scared. I recognized the signs. Boys especially need strong boundaries. Seth looked at his wife, seeing her in a new light. He's 7 years old. 7. Children have tantrums. That's normal. Normal isn't good enough, Natalie said coolly. I was raised to be better than normal. Obedient. Respectful. Successful. I want the same for our son. So you decided to torture him. Enhanced discipline, Dolores corrected. 1 hour in the walls, Seth. Just 1 hour when he misbehaved. Then we'd let him out, clean him up, give him a good meal. He was learning. Another month or two and he would have been completely reformed. Seth's mind was reeling. For months. They'd been doing this for 4 months, and he'd noticed nothing. How could he have been so blind? But he knew how. The late nights at the warehouse, the overtime during inventory season, the business trips Natalie had encouraged him to take, a logistics conference in Chicago, training sessions in Denver. She'd always been so supportive of his career advancement, so eager for him to work late. Because it gave her time alone with Robbie. His teacher, Seth said slowly. Did Ms. Chin ever notice anything? Natalie laughed, a brittle sound. We were careful. We only used the walls on weekends or after school, never more than 2 hours. Always made sure he was cleaned up, well-fed, happy-looking before school. And if he ever tried to tell anyone. She looked down at Robbie. Well, we had our methods of ensuring his silence. Robbie flinched in Seth's arms. Show me, Seth said suddenly. Both women looked at him in surprise. Show me everything. If I'm going to accept this, if I'm going to help keep this quiet, I need to understand the full extent. The walls, the methods, everything. Dolores studied him carefully. You're not just saying that to gather evidence? Seth forced a bitter laugh. Evidence for what? You said it yourself. Child services would take Robbie away from both of us during an investigation. That could take months, years. He'd be in foster care, passed between strangers. He looked down at his son's face, let real anguish seep into his voice. I can't lose him. If this is what it takes to keep our family together, then I need to understand it. It was the right thing to say. He could see Dolores softening, see Natalie's shoulders relax. Very well, Dolores said, standing. Come with me. She led them through the house, narrating like a tour guide. The wall cavity where Robbie had been held extended down to the first floor, accessible through a panel behind the basement utility shelf. She showed Seth how they'd cut into the wall years ago when she'd first moved in, how they'd reinforced the studs, installed the eye bolts for the zip ties. We started slow, Natalie explained, as if discussing a training regimen. Just 30 minutes at first. After that tantrum he threw when we wouldn't let him have ice cream before dinner. Mom said we had to establish dominance early. Seth's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. But he nodded, kept his expression neutral, kept playing the role of the husband trying to understand. They showed him the schedule they'd kept, a composition notebook hidden in Dolores's bedroom, documenting dates, times, infractions, and punishments. Seth memorized the location, the details. We were very careful, Dolores said proudly. Scientific, even. We monitored his breathing, made sure he had enough air. We checked the zip ties to ensure they weren't cutting off circulation too severely. This isn't abuse, Seth. This is controlled, purposeful discipline. And the others? Seth asked quietly. Stewart Jr.? Where is he now? Portland, like I said. He's 41 now. I send him a Christmas card every year. He never responds. Dolores shrugged. Some children hold grudges. Can I see the bones? Both women hesitated. Natalie looked to her mother. Why? Dolores asked suspiciously. Because if I'm going to keep this secret, I need to know exactly what I'm protecting. I need to see what happens if the discipline goes too far, so I can make sure it doesn't happen to Robbie. It was the right logic. After a moment, Dolores nodded. Back upstairs, Seth peered into the wall cavity with a flashlight Natalie provided. The bones were definitely there, small skeletons in various states of decay, tangled in old insulation. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to study them, to count them, to document everything mentally. 2 small skulls, one slightly larger. The twins and someone else? Or had Dolores been lying about the count? How did you dispose of them? Seth asked. I didn't, Dolores said simply. When I sold the Sycamore Street house in 1993, I sealed the walls properly. Let the new owners deal with it if they ever renovate it. But they haven't. I drive by sometimes. The house is still standing, walls intact. And when we modified this wall for Robbie, well, I decided to bring a little piece of history with me. A reminder of what happens when children don't learn. She was insane. Completely, utterly insane. And Natalie had been trained by her, molded by her, turned into a monster who saw nothing wrong with torturing a child. Seth glanced down at Robbie, who had remained silent through the entire tour. His son's eyes were hollow, distant. Shocked, probably. Trauma. How much therapy would it take to fix this? How much damage had already been done? The fever Seth had been fighting all afternoon surged back with a vengeance. His head spun, his stomach roiled. But his mind was clearer than it had ever been. I need to lie down, he said finally. I'm still sick. Let me sleep on this, and we'll talk more in the morning. Dolores studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Very well. But Seth, her voice took on a hard edge. If you betray us, if you go to the police, remember what I said. They'll take Robbie away. You'll be investigated too, as the father who somehow never noticed. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your job, your life, all of it gone. And Robbie will end up in foster care, or worse, with me as his legal guardian if Natalie and I play our cards right. The threat was clear. She'd spent decades perfecting her mask of normalcy, learning how to manipulate systems, how to make herself look like the victim or the hero. She'd do it again. I understand, Seth said quietly. He took Robbie upstairs to his bedroom, his son's bedroom, which suddenly looked different to Seth. Had he been sleeping here on the nights he was punished? Or had they kept him in the walls overnight too? Seth tucked Robbie into bed, his hands gentle on his son's shoulders. Robbie, he whispered. Buddy, I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that? Robbie nodded slightly, his eyes finally focusing on his father's face. I'm going to fix this. I promise. But I need you to pretend everything's normal for a little while longer. Can you do that? Another nod, smaller this time. Good boy. Seth kissed his forehead. I love you. No matter what happens, remember that I love you, and I'm going to keep you safe. Robbie's hand clutched Seth's shirt. Daddy, he whispered. Don't let them put me back in the dark. Never, Seth said fiercely. Never again. I swear it. He stayed with Robbie until his son finally fell asleep, exhausted from trauma and fear. Then Seth went to his own bedroom, locked the door, and began to plan. His phone was still downstairs where Natalie had knocked it from his hand. But he had his laptop, password protected, and stored in his nightstand. He opened it quietly, keeping the volume off. First, he researched child abuse laws in their state. Mandatory reporting. Evidence requirements. Statute of limitations for old cases. He made mental notes of everything, carefully closing each browser tab after reading. Then he looked up Stuart Reed in Portland. Found him easily, corporate attorney at a firm called Blackstone and Associates. No photo on the website, but the bio matched. Yale Law, specialization in contract law, 41 years old. Seth drafted an email, keeping it vague. Mr. Reed, you don't know me, but I recently married into your family. I need to speak with you urgently about your mother, Dolores Reed. This concerns events from your childhood. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Seth Jones. He included his work email address, not his phone number. Then he hesitated, his finger hovering over the send button. If Stuart warned Dolores, everything could fall apart. But if Stuart had been victimized the same way Robbie had been, if he'd escaped that house and build a new life. Seth pressed send. Next, he began documenting everything in a password-protected file. The composition notebook's location, the modified wall, the bones. Every detail Dolores had shared about Sarah and Samuel. The dates of Robbie's punishments that he could remember, the weekends he'd worked late, the times he'd come home to find Robbie unusually quiet and subdued. He took screenshots of text messages between himself and Natalie, looking for patterns. There, 3 months ago. Don't come home early today, taking Robbie to see Mom. And 2 months ago, working on Robbie's behavior with Mom. Might take a few hours. Hidden in plain sight. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. Seth's hands shook as he typed, from fever and fury and fear. He needed more evidence. He needed undeniable proof. And he needed to ensure that when this all came crashing down, Robbie would be protected, not traumatized further by a lengthy investigation. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. Seth. Natalie's voice. Can I come in? He quickly minimized the document, pulled up a generic news website. Just a minute. He opened the door. Natalie stood there in her pajamas, her expression unreadable. I want you to know, she said quietly, that I love Robbie. Everything Mom and I did was because we love him and want him to grow up right. Seth looked at this woman he'd married, this woman he'd thought he knew. I know, he lied. Do you? She searched his face. Because I know you, Seth. You're a good man, a moral man. This is hard for you to accept. But sometimes morality and love mean making hard choices. I understand. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. I need to know you're with us. With me. That you won't do anything rash. Seth covered her hand with his own, forced himself not to recoil from her touch. I'm processing. That's all. I need time. Natalie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. After she left, Seth waited 10 minutes, then crept out of the bedroom. He moved silently through the house. Years of working early morning shifts had taught him which floorboards creaked, and retrieved his phone from the kitchen floor. Back in his room, he synced his documentation to the cloud, then sent a second email, this one to himself at work, with all the files attached. Backup upon backup. Then he opened his phone's camera and began taking photographs. The wall damage he'd made. The composition notebook in Dolores's room, every page documented. The utility shelf panel that gave access to the wall cavity. He couldn't photograph the bones without better light and without alerting the women, but he'd seen enough to testify to their existence. Finally, around 2 a.m., Seth collapsed onto his bed, exhausted. His fever had broken, leaving him soaked with sweat, but clear-headed. Tomorrow, he would begin phase 2. Tomorrow, he would start building the trap. Wednesday morning dawned cold and gray. Seth woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Dolores humming in the kitchen, some cheerful tune that made his skin crawl. He found Robbie at the kitchen table, eating cereal. His son looked up when Seth entered, eyes wide and questioning. Seth gave him a subtle nod, a silent message, it's okay. Play along. Morning, Seth said, keeping his voice neutral. He poured himself coffee, noting that Natalie and Dolores were watching him carefully. How are you feeling? Natalie asked. Better. Fever broke during the night. Seth sat down across from Robbie. I was thinking I should stay home today. Keep an eye on Robbie. Make sure he's okay after yesterday's incident. That won't be necessary, Dolores said quickly. Natalie and I have everything under control. And you have that big shipment coming in today. Miguel mentioned it when he called yesterday to check on you. Seth had forgotten about the Bronson shipment, a major delivery that required his supervision. Dolores had clearly done her homework. Right, Seth said slowly. But Robbie. We'll be fine, Natalie interjected. He understands that yesterday was a learning experience. Don't you, sweetheart? Robbie nodded mechanically, spooning cereal into his mouth without seeming to taste it. Seth's mind raced. He couldn't leave Robbie alone with them, but if he refused to go to work, they'd know something was wrong. He needed them to believe he was compliant, at least for now. Okay, he said finally. But I want to talk to Robbie alone before I go. The women exchanged a glance, but nodded. Seth took his son upstairs, into Robbie's bedroom, and closed the door. Daddy, Robbie whispered immediately, I don't want to stay here. Please don't leave me. I have to, buddy. Just for today. But listen, Seth knelt down, gripping his son's shoulders. I need you to be the bravest you've ever been. Can you do that? Robbie's lower lip trembled, but he nodded. If they try to put you in the walls again, if they try to hurt you at all, you scream as loud as you can. You make noise, you break things if you have to. The neighbors will hear. Mrs. Ellis next door, she'll call the police. Understand. But Mom said if I ever tell anyone. Mom was wrong. Mom and Grandma are wrong about everything. Seth pulled out his phone, quickly typing in his work number. If anything happens, if you get scared, you call this number. It goes straight to my desk. Miguel will come get me immediately. Robbie memorized the number. Seth made him repeat it 3 times. Then Seth pulled his son into a tight hug. Tonight, he whispered, everything changes. I promise. At work, Seth could barely focus. He went through the motions of checking in the Bronson shipment, verifying inventory, signing off on delivery manifests. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. During his lunch break, he made several calls. First, to an attorney, not a family lawyer, but a criminal defense attorney named Lloyd Bond who'd been recommended by a coworker years ago when someone at the warehouse got into legal trouble. Seth explained the situation in vague terms. Potential child abuse case, need for advice on evidence gathering and protective custody. Bond listened carefully. You need to document everything before going to police, he said. Without solid evidence, it becomes he said she said, and the child gets traumatized by a lengthy investigation. You need photographs of the wall modifications, medical evidence of injuries, and if possible, recorded confessions. Recorded confessions? Seth asked. Audio or video? Your state is a one-party consent state for recordings, meaning you can legally record conversations you're part of without the other party's knowledge. Get them talking, get them admitting to what they've done. That's your smoking gun. Seth's second call was to a private investigator named Clifford Keenan, recommended by Bond. He explained the situation more fully this time. I can do some preliminary work, Keenan said. Background checks on the mother-in-law, property records for the old house on Sycamore Street. See if there are any missing persons reports from the late 80s that match her story. But this is going to take a few days at minimum. I don't have a few days, Seth said. My son is trapped in that house with them right now. Then you need to get him out. Take him somewhere safe, then we build the case. But Seth had already considered that option. If he grabbed Robbie and ran, Dolores and Natalie would lawyer up immediately. They'd claim he was unstable, that he'd kidnapped Robbie during a psychotic break. They'd use his work stress and sudden illness as evidence of mental instability. No, he needed them to confess everything on record first. He needed undeniable proof. His third call was to Stuart Reed. The attorney answered on the second ring. Stuart Reed speaking. Mr. Reed, this is Seth Jones. I emailed you last night. I got it. Stuart's voice was cold, controlled. What's this about? Seth took a deep breath. Your mother has been abusing my son, using the same methods she used on you. I need to know what happened to you. What happened in that house on Sycamore Street? A long silence. Then, how did you find out? I came home early yesterday. Found my son tied up in a wall cavity. Your mother explained her methods to me. She told me about Sarah and Samuel. Another silence, longer this time. When Stuart spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. She told you about the twins? She said Sarah died in the walls. That Samuel tried to escape, and she had to quiet him. Is that true? Jesus Christ. Stuart let out a shaky breath. I haven't thought about them in years. I've spent my entire adult life trying to forget. I need you to remember, Seth said urgently. I need you to tell me everything, on record. Because I'm going to take her down, Mr. Reed, but I need your help to do it. Call me Stuart. Another pause. What do you need? They talked for 20 minutes. Stuart described his childhood in painful detail. The first time Dolores put him in the walls, how long it lasted, how he'd learned to dissociate during the hours of darkness. He talked about the twins, how young they'd been, how Sarah had been only 4 years old when she died. I tried to help them, Stuart said, his voice breaking. But I was just a kid myself, only 12. And I was terrified of her. After Samuel died, she told me that if I ever told anyone, I'd end up in the walls permanently. So I kept quiet. I survived until I was 18, then I got the hell out. Changed my name from Reed to my stepfather's name. My mom remarried briefly when I was 15. Never looked back. You never reported her? By the time I was old enough and far enough away to feel safe, it had been years. No evidence, no bodies. She'd sealed that wall before selling the house. It would have been my word against hers, and she's very good at playing the victim. Stuart's voice hardened. But if you have evidence, if you have proof of what she's doing now, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. Seth felt something loosen in his chest. Thank you. Save your son, Stuart said quietly. Don't let him turn out like me. Don't let him spend his whole life running from shadows. After the call ended, Seth sat in his car in the warehouse parking lot, formulating his plan. He had Stewart's testimony. He had his own documentation. He had attorney Bond ready to represent him. He had investigator Keenan doing background work. Now he needed the confessions. He returned to work, finished his shift. At 5:45 p.m., he called Natalie. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice casual. "I was thinking we should all sit down tonight, talk everything through properly. Maybe order pizza, make it relaxed. I want to understand Mom's methods better, and I think Robbie should be part of the conversation. Help him understand why discipline is necessary." He could practically hear Natalie's smile through the phone. "That's a great idea. Mom will be pleased you're coming around. I'll pick up the pizza on the way home." "Lou's Pizzeria? Perfect." Seth stopped at Lou's, ordered 3 large pizzas, far more food than they needed, but it added to the appearance of a peace offering. While he waited, he tested the recording app on his phone, making sure it would capture clear audio even from his pocket. When he arrived home at 6:30, Dolores and Natalie were in high spirits. They'd set the dining room table, the one they only used for special occasions, with the good dishes. Robbie sat on the couch in the living room, silent and pale. Seth caught his son's eye and gave a reassuring nod. Then he set the pizzas on the table and took out his phone, pretending to silence it. Instead, he activated the recording app and slipped it into his shirt pocket, microphone facing out. "So," Seth said, settling into his chair, "I've been thinking about everything you told me yesterday. About discipline, about structure. I want to understand the philosophy behind it better." Dolores beamed. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Seth. So many fathers these days are too soft, too permissive. It's refreshing to meet a man willing to do what's necessary." "Walk me through the process," Seth said. "From the beginning. How did you develop these methods?" And Dolores, proud and eager to share her wisdom, began to talk. Seth guided the conversation with careful questions, getting her to describe specific incidents, specific dates. He got her to explain how she'd modified the wall in their house, how long Robbie had been subjected to the discipline, what she'd done to Sarah and Samuel all those years ago. Natalie chimed in with her own observations, describing how Robbie had improved under the discipline, how his tantrums had decreased. "Of course," Dolores said, "the key is consistency. You can't be soft. When Stewart tried to help the twins escape, I had to make an example of Samuel. The boy simply wouldn't learn. Some children are irredeemable." "How did you?" Seth forced himself to ask. "How did you quiet him?" "Plastic bag," Dolores said matter-of-factly. "Quick and clean. Then I sealed him in the wall with his sister. A few months later, I sold the house. The new owners have no idea what's in their walls." Seth's stomach turned, but he kept his expression neutral, kept asking questions, kept the recording going. They talked for over an hour, and Dolores confessed to everything. The deaths of the twins, the abuse of Stewart, the 4 months of torturing Robbie. All of it recorded. All of it admissible in court. Finally, Seth stood up. "I need to use the bathroom," he said. "Be right back." He went upstairs, closed the bathroom door, and immediately texted Lloyd Bond. "Have full confession on audio." "What now?" The response came quickly. "Get child out of house immediately. Take recording to police. I'll meet you there." Seth flushed the toilet for authenticity, then went to Robbie's room. His son was still downstairs with the women, but Seth grabbed a backpack and quickly stuffed it with clothes, Robbie's favorite stuffed dinosaur, his blanket. Then he went back downstairs, keeping his movements casual. "Robbie, buddy, come help me get something from the car." Robbie stood immediately, moving toward his father. "Why does he need to go to the car?" Natalie asked suspiciously. "I got him some comic books at the store," Seth said easily. "Left them in the trunk." It was a flimsy excuse, but it got Robbie to the front door. Seth opened it, ushered his son through, and Dolores was suddenly there, blocking their path. "I don't think so," she said softly. Seth's hand moved to shield Robbie. "Get out of the way. You recorded us, didn't you?" Dolores's eyes glittered with malice. "I'm not as foolish as you think, Seth. I've been watching you all evening, watching you guide the conversation. You're planning to turn us in. I'm protecting my son." "No." Dolores's hand shot out, grabbing Robbie's arm. "You're destroying your family. Natalie, call the police. Tell them Seth's having a psychotic episode, that he's trying to kidnap Robbie." Natalie hesitated, looking between her mother and her husband. "Now, Natalie," Dolores barked. But Seth was already moving. He grabbed Robbie, yanking him free from Dolores's grip, and bolted for the door. Behind him, he heard Dolores screaming, heard Natalie's confused protests. He ran to his car, threw Robbie inside, peeled out of the driveway. In his rearview mirror, he saw Dolores standing in the doorway, phone to her ear, her face twisted with rage. The race was on. Who would the police believe? The distraught grandmother reporting a kidnapping, or the father with an audio recording of murder confessions? Seth drove straight to the police station, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Robbie sat in the passenger seat, clutching his stuffed dinosaur, silent tears streaming down his face. "It's okay," Seth kept saying. "It's going to be okay. They can't hurt you anymore." He just hoped that was true. The Riverside Police Department's lobby was fluorescent bright and institutional. Seth burst through the doors at 8:47 p.m., Robbie's hand clutched tightly in his own, Lloyd Bond's business card in his other hand. "I need to report child abuse," Seth announced to the desk sergeant, a stocky man named Ernie Dunbar according to his nameplate. "And 2 murders from 1987. I have evidence, audio recordings of full confessions." Sergeant Dunbar's eyebrows rose. "Slow down, sir. Let's start with your name." "Seth Jones. This is my son, Robbie. My wife and mother-in-law have been torturing him, and—" The desk phone rang. Dunbar held up a hand to Seth, answered it. His expression changed as he listened. "I see," he said into the phone. "Yes, he's here now. With a child." He listened more. "Understood." He hung up and regarded Seth with new suspicion. "Mr. Jones, that was your wife. She says you've had a mental break, that you grabbed your son and fled the house during a paranoid episode. She's on her way here now." "She's lying," Seth said urgently. "Please, you need to listen to the recording. I have proof." "Sir, why don't you and your son have a seat?" "No." Seth's voice was firm. "I'm not sitting down. I'm not waiting. I have evidence of felony child abuse and murder. You need to listen to it now, before my wife gets here and tries to manipulate the situation." Something in Seth's tone must have registered, because Dunbar hesitated. Then he picked up his phone again. "Detective McIntyre, I need you in the lobby. We have a situation." Detective Katie McIntyre appeared 3 minutes later, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to Seth's rapid-fire explanation, then looked down at Robbie. "Son," she said gently, "has anyone hurt you?" Robbie nodded, holding up his wrists. The welts from the zip ties were still visible, angry red marks against his pale skin. McIntyre's expression hardened. "Bring them both back to interview room 2, she told Dunbar. Then to Seth, "Let me hear this recording." In the interview room, Seth played the audio on his phone. McIntyre listened intently, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. When Dolores's voice described suffocating Samuel with a plastic bag, McIntyre stopped the recording. "This is Dolores Reed, my mother-in-law. She's been living with us for 6 weeks. And she confessed to murdering 2 children in 1987, her daughter's half-siblings, Sarah and Samuel Reed. Their bodies are in the walls of a house on Sycamore Street. She sold it in 1993. And there are bones in our house, too, in the wall cavity where they were keeping Robbie." McIntyre stood. "Wait here. I need to make some calls." She left, and Seth gathered Robbie into his lap. His son was trembling, exhausted from fear and adrenaline. "You did so good," Seth whispered. "So brave. It's almost over." 20 minutes later, McIntyre returned with another detective, a man she introduced as Detective Howard Roberson from the Cold Case Unit. They had Seth play the recording again, this time from the beginning. "The house on Sycamore Street," Roberson said. "What's the address?" Seth rattled it off. "Dolores told me she sealed the bodies in the walls before selling. The current owners don't know." Roberson was already on his phone, barking orders. "I want a forensics team at 2847 Sycamore Street. Possible human remains in the walls. And I want patrol units at 445 Maple Drive for evidence collection." McIntyre focused on Seth. "Your wife, she's complicit in the recent abuse." "Yes. She was learning her mother's methods. It's all on the recording." As if summoned, Natalie burst into the police station lobby. Seth could hear her voice, high and frantic, through the interview room door. "My husband took my son. He's sick. He's not thinking clearly, please." McIntyre went to intercept her. Through the small window in the door, Seth watched as his wife's performance fell apart. McIntyre showed her something, Probably a photo of Robbie's wrists, and Natalie's face went pale. "I want to speak to my attorney," Seth heard her say. "That's your right," McIntyre replied. "You're going to need one. Natalie Jones, you're under arrest for child abuse and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Seth closed his eyes, relief washing over him. It was happening. They believed him. Dolores was arrested an hour later at the house on Maple Drive, where she'd been attempting to demolish the wall cavity with a sledgehammer. Patrol officers stopped her before she could destroy the evidence, and forensics photographed everything: the modified walls, the bones, the composition notebook documenting Robbie's punishments. By midnight, both women were in custody. The house on Sycamore Street had been secured, and a forensics team was preparing to excavate the walls at first light. Seth and Robbie were taken to a hotel by victim services, a woman named Flora Newman who was gentle and kind. She arranged for a medical examination for Robbie, documenting his injuries, his malnutrition, his psychological trauma. "You'll both need to stay available for questioning," McIntyre told Seth. "But you did the right thing. You saved your son." That night, Seth lay awake in the hotel room while Robbie finally slept, the exhaustion and trauma catching up with him. Seth stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything. The moment he'd swung that sledgehammer, the horror of discovery, Dolores's casual confession of murder. He'd won. He'd gotten Robbie out safely, gotten them arrested, secured the evidence. But this was only the beginning. There would be trials, testimony, media attention. Robbie would need therapy, years of it probably. And Seth would have to rebuild their lives from the ashes of this nightmare. Still, as he watched his son sleep peacefully for the first time in months, Seth felt a grim satisfaction. Dolores Reed had thought she was untouchable, thought her methods were justified, thought she could continue her decades-long reign of terror. She'd been wrong, and now she would pay for every moment of suffering she'd inflicted. The excavation of 2847 Sycamore Street took 3 days. The current owners, a couple named Ray and Marina Kelly who'd lived there for 18 years, watched in horror as forensics teams tore into their living room wall. Seth watched the news coverage from the hotel room, Robbie curled up beside him. The press had picked up the story quickly. Grandmother of horror. Cold case murders solved after 37 years. Authorities have confirmed the discovery of remains belonging to 2 children in the walls of this quiet suburban home, the reporter said. Sarah and Samuel Reed, aged 4 and 6, who disappeared in 1987 and were believed to be runaways, were actually murdered by their mother, Dolores Reed, who sealed their bodies in the walls before selling the property. Ray Kelly appeared on screen, looking shell-shocked. "We've lived here for almost 2 decades. Our kids grew up in this house. And there were bodies in our walls the whole time." The investigation expanded rapidly. Stuart Reed flew in from Portland, finally ready to testify about his own abuse. Detective Roberson discovered that Dolores's father, the man who'd taught her the wall methods, had died in 1994, but his own history revealed multiple arrests for child cruelty in the 1960s, before laws had been strengthened. A pattern emerged: generational abuse, passed down and refined, creating a lineage of monsters. Lloyd Bond met with Seth Daly, preparing for the legal battles ahead. "Dolores is trying to claim diminished capacity," he explained. "Says she was doing what she thought was right based on how she was raised. Her attorney's going for an insanity defense." "She's not insane," Seth said flatly. "She knew exactly what she was doing. She documented it in that notebook, kept it hidden, had contingency plans. That's not insanity, that's sociopathy." "I agree. And the prosecutor thinks so too. They're going for first-degree murder on Sarah and Samuel, multiple counts of child abuse, false imprisonment, and attempted murder for the attack on Robbie's well-being." "What about Natalie?" Bond's expression was grim. "She's cooperating, turning on her mother. Says she was coerced, manipulated, that she didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. Her attorney's trying to get the charges reduced to conspiracy and child endangerment." Seth felt no sympathy for his wife. She knew. She participated. She should go to prison. She probably will. But not for as long as Dolores. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The bones from both houses were examined. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Sarah and Samuel Reed. Cause of death for Samuel: asphyxiation. Sarah's remains showed signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration. Stuart's testimony was devastating. Now 41 years old, successful and seemingly well-adjusted, he broke down on the stand describing the hours in the dark, the hunger, the fear. The jury wept with him. Robbie's testimony was conducted via closed-circuit television to protect him from further trauma. He described the walls, the darkness, the zip ties. He showed his scars, physical and emotional. And Seth testified about the discovery, the confession, the recording that had captured everything. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The media dubbed it the House of Horrors trial, and public opinion was savage. Dolores Reed became a household name, a cautionary tale, a monster. On the final day, Seth sat in the courtroom as the verdicts were read. On the count of first-degree murder of Sarah Reed, guilty. On the count of first-degree murder of Samuel Reed, guilty. On the counts of child abuse, false imprisonment, and attempted murder, guilty on all counts. Dolores's face remained impassive as the judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. At 68 years old, she would die in prison. Natalie received 15 years, with possibility of parole after 10. She'd cooperated, shown remorse, agreed to undergo psychiatric treatment. Seth thought it was too lenient, but Lloyd assured him it was a reasonable outcome given her own history of abuse under Dolores. She's a victim too, Bond said. Raised by a monster, taught that this was normal. She's an adult, Seth countered. She made choices. She hurt Robbie. I know, and she'll pay for those choices. Seth filed for divorce the day after the sentencing. He was awarded full custody of Robbie, with Natalie's parental rights severely restricted. When she was eventually released from prison, she'd be allowed supervised visitation only, and only if Robbie wanted it. Stuart Reed reached out after the trial, inviting Seth and Robbie to visit Portland. I think it might help, he said. Seeing someone who survived what Robbie survived. Seeing that life can be normal again. They went. Stuart's home was bright and spacious, decorated with artwork and photographs of hiking trips and marathons. He'd built a good life despite the darkness of his past. It took years of therapy, Stuart told Seth while Robbie played with Stuart's golden retriever in the backyard. And I still have nightmares sometimes. But you can heal from this. You both can. He flinches when I close doors, Seth said quietly. He checks every room before entering, making sure there aren't any closed spaces. He won't let me leave him alone with anyone. That's normal. That's protective. But it will get better, slowly. You're doing everything right. The therapy, the patience, the constant reassurance. Just keep doing that. Seth watched his son laugh as the dog licked his face, and felt a surge of hope. Maybe Stuart was right. Maybe they could heal. 6 months after the trial, Clifford Keenan, the private investigator, called with interesting news. He'd been digging into Dolores's background, tracing her family tree. Your mother-in-law had 3 siblings, Keenan said. All of them estranged from her for decades. I tracked down 2 of them, one in Arizona, one in Florida. Both refused to talk about Dolores, but they made it clear they're not surprised by what happened. Why? Because they were abused by their father too. Same methods, same walls. They all escaped as soon as they could, changed their names, never looked back. Dolores was the only one who stayed, who learned from him, who continued his legacy. Seth felt sick. How many children had suffered across generations of this twisted family? How many had died? How many had survived but lived with the scars? There's more, Keenan continued. The old house where Dolores grew up, it was demolished in 2003. But before that, there were rumors. Neighbors reported strange sounds, children crying in the walls. But no one ever investigated. Child Protective Services were called twice in the 1970s, but the family passed inspections. Another failure of the system. Another missed opportunity to stop the cycle. But the cycle was broken now. Dolores would never hurt another child. Natalie was in prison, and Robbie was safe. Seth threw himself into being the father Robbie needed. He cut back his hours at work, arranged flexible scheduling so he could attend every therapy session, every school conference, every moment his son needed him. Miguel, his supervisor, was understanding. Family first, he said. Always. The media attention eventually faded. Other stories took precedence. The house on Maple Drive was sold. Seth couldn't bear to live there anymore, and they moved to a smaller place across town, a bright apartment on the 3rd floor with no walls thick enough to hide secrets. Robbie started sleeping through the night again after 8 months. He made friends at his new school, joined the soccer team, began to laugh more freely. And Seth started to breathe again. 3 years later, Seth stood in the visitors' parking lot of the Oregon State Correctional Facility, staring at the concrete and razor wire. "You don't have to do this," Lloyd Bond said. He'd driven up from the city for this. Moral support for what Seth knew would be a difficult conversation. "I need to," Seth said. Inside, through the security checks and steel doors, Seth finally came face to face with Natalie for the first time since the trial. She looked older, worn down by prison life. Her hair streaked with gray she hadn't had at 32. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, separated by a table and 3 years of pain. "Why are you here?" Natalie asked. Her voice was hoarse, broken. "To ask you a question," Seth said. "Did you ever love him? Did you ever really love Robbie?" Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I did. I thought I was helping him. Mom convinced me it was the right thing, that modern parenting was too soft, that we were preparing him for a harsh world." She wiped her eyes. "But I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I'll never forgive myself." "Good," Seth said coldly. "You shouldn't. How is he?" "He's healing. He's in therapy 3 times a week. He plays soccer now, has friends, gets good grades. He's resilient, stronger than either of us deserves." "Does he ask about me?" "No. It was a lie. Robbie did ask, sometimes, late at night when the memories crept in. But Natalie didn't need to know that. She didn't deserve that comfort." Natalie nodded, accepting it. "I signed the divorce papers. I'm not fighting for custody when I get out. I know I don't deserve him." "You're right. You don't. Will you?" Natalie hesitated. "Will you tell him I'm sorry? That I know what I did was unforgivable, but I'm sorry anyway." Seth stood. "I'll tell him when he's ready to hear it. If he's ever ready." He left without looking back. In the parking lot, Bond clapped him on the shoulder. "Feel better?" "No. But I needed to see her. Needed to confirm that she understood what she'd done. She does, or at least she says she does." Seth took a deep breath of free air. "Let's go home." Home was the apartment he shared with Robbie, modest but filled with light. Home was the smell of his son's favorite pasta sauce cooking on the stove. Home was the sound of Robbie's laughter when they played video games together. Home was safe now. Dolores never showed remorse. Seth kept track of her through news reports and official filings. She continued to insist she'd done nothing wrong, that her methods were legitimate discipline, that society was too soft on children. She filed appeal after appeal, each one denied. She gave jailhouse interviews claiming she was the real victim, persecuted for traditional parenting methods. The public vilified her. She became a cautionary tale in psychology textbooks, a case study in generational abuse and sociopathy. And Robbie, slowly but surely, became himself again. By age 11, he was excelling in school. He'd found a passion for art, drawing intricate landscapes that his therapist said represented his journey from darkness to light. By 13, he started talking about what had happened, processing it aloud instead of burying it. Seth listened, supported, never pushed. By 15, Robbie stood before a packed auditorium at a child advocacy conference and told his story. He spoke about the walls, the darkness, the fear. And he spoke about his father, the man who'd saved him, who'd believed him, who'd risked everything to protect him. "Child abuse thrives in silence," Robbie said, his voice strong and clear. "My father broke that silence. He listened when I couldn't speak. He saw what others missed. And he taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival." Seth watched from the audience, tears streaming down his face. This was his son, not broken, not defined by trauma, but strengthened by survival. A young man who'd taken the worst experience imaginable and transformed it into purpose. After the conference, reporters swarmed them. Seth shielded Robbie from the more invasive questions, but one reporter's query stood out. "Mr. Jones, looking back, do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation?" Seth thought about that sledgehammer breaking through drywall. He thought about the recording device in his pocket, gathering evidence. He thought about the split-second decision to run, to trust his instincts, to protect his son above all else. "Only one," he said. "I regret that I didn't see it sooner. But I'll never regret fighting for my son. I'll never regret bringing those monsters to justice." Stuart Reed, now 44 and a partner at his law firm, had become a friend and mentor to Robbie. He'd established a foundation in memory of Sarah and Samuel Reed, providing resources and therapy for child abuse survivors. Your father did what mine couldn't, Stewart told Robbie during one of their visits. He saw the truth and acted. That's real courage. What happened to your father? Robbie asked. Your biological father, I mean. Stewart's expression darkened. Gerald Reed died of a heart attack in 2009. Never knew about the trial. Never knew what Dolores had done to his children. Maybe that was a mercy. The years passed. Dolores Reed died in prison in 2031, at age 73, of lung cancer. She never admitted wrongdoing, never apologized, never showed empathy for her victims. Natalie was released in 2028 after serving 13 years. She moved to a different state, changed her name, and never attempted to contact Robbie. Seth heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd remarried, had no other children, and lived a quiet life of isolation and regret. Robbie graduated high school with honors, attended college on a scholarship, and became a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. He dedicated his career to helping other victims, breaking the cycle of abuse one patient at a time. And Seth, watching his son become the man he was meant to be, felt a profound sense of completion. The nightmare was over. The monsters had been defeated. Justice had been served. On Robbie's 21st birthday, father and son stood in the backyard of Seth's new house. He'd finally bought a place with Robbie's input, a bright modern home with open floor plans and windows everywhere. No dark corners, no hidden spaces. Dad, Robbie said, I never thank you properly. For everything. You don't need to thank me, Seth replied. I'm your father. Protecting you was never a choice. It was instinct. Still, Robbie turned to face him. You could have looked the other way. You could have convinced yourself I was fine. But you trusted your instincts, you fought for me, and you made sure those people could never hurt anyone again. That's heroic. Seth pulled his son into a hug. You're the hero, Robbie. You survived. You healed. You turned your pain into purpose. I just did what any decent father would do. Exactly, Robbie said. You were decent. In a situation designed to break people, you stayed decent and strong and smart. That's everything. They stood together in the sunlight, father and son, survivors both. The shadows of the past couldn't touch them here, couldn't reach them anymore. The walls had been torn down. The monsters had been imprisoned. The truth had been spoken. And the boy who'd once whispered from the darkness, Daddy, I'm not alone in here, now stood in the light, whole and healthy and free. Justice, Seth reflected, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about protecting the innocent, about breaking cycles of abuse, about ensuring that darkness could never again masquerade as light. He'd done that. They'd done that together. And that, he thought as he watched Robbie laugh and plan his future, was the only victory that mattered. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.